Welcome back to Backyard Wrench Bender. If you watched last week's episode, you know that I am waiting for an air pump so I can put some primer on the fastback. So this week I'm going to be working on a little bit of a different project. I've got a box here that we're going to go open, do a little bit of an unboxing, and then we'll get into the details of the project. Let's get to work. Alright, what you're looking at here is a box from A-Team by Southwest Performance Parts.
While I open this, I just want to remind you that this is not sponsored, and I'm not trying to sell you anything. There are no links in the description, and I'm not telling you where I got this from. As you can see, this is a product that is sold by Southwest Performance Parts and is made in China, as are most things you purchase these days. This is the A-Team 21 circuit hot rod wiring harness. And unlike other high-end companies, this harness is generic, does not come with all the connectors, and requires some ingenuity to install. But it also cost me about $80, which is the main reason I went this route. So what does $80 get you? A generic set of instructions. Mine came with a speed hole already installed. It came with a 21 circuit fuse box and labeled GM color-coded wires. And it also came with a bag of zip ties and miscellaneous parts.
So if you haven't guessed by now, we're going to wire up a car. But it's probably not the one you're thinking. Let me explain. This is my daily driver.
Recently, I started getting death wobble really bad. So I went in and replaced the ball joints and completely rebuilt the steering.
The problem I realize I essentially have 3 hobby cars. And that means if my daily driver breaks, I've got no way to get around. I could go out and buy a 4th car, but that seems wasteful seeing how I've got all the parts I need to build a second driver, and I should be able to do it relatively quickly. Since this is the Mustang that I actually wanted, I don't want to rush it. I want to make sure I build it right. So the logical choice is the parts car is now going to be the backup daily driver. So I'm not too worried about making it look nice. I might throw a coat of primer on it just to stop any rust that might be forming. But the big goal is to make it mechanically sound and safe to drive. So first thing I'm going to have to do is make sure that engine turns over. Then I need to throw all the parts back in. And the only thing that I don't have to make this a complete car is a wiring harness.
Step 1. Read the instructions. Step 2. Remove the old wire harness. So the firewall connectors on this car are old and brittle, and I'm not going to reuse them. So I opted to just grab a screwdriver and force them back into the cab. Inside, the first thing to go is the gauge cluster. It has 6 screws, and all the connections behind it need to be disconnected. Most of the connections you can just grab and pull off, but what you see me doing here is reaching around and unscrewing the speedometer cable. And once that's disconnected, you should be able to pull it right out. In my case, 2 of the gauge lights were proving to be a little more difficult and needed a little more force to come off. And with that out of the way, it's time to get the ignition, the wiper, and the light switch out of the way. With the ignition, you should be able to get behind it, push it forward, and rotate the ring around it counterclockwise, and it should come off. But with this car being almost 60 years old and a good chance that this has never come off, it didn't want to cooperate.
While trying to get this off, the electrical portion of the ignition came off the back. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this and continue. But we're going to probably need to get this off at some point. And what you're supposed to be able to do is push forward on the back and push the ring in and rotate counterclockwise, and it's supposed to pop out.
For the headlight, there's a button just behind the dash that you push, and the knob will come right out. Once the knob is out, you put a Phillips head in there, spin the ring, and the whole thing comes out. And finally, the wiper knob is held on by an Allen key on the bottom of it. Just loosen that up and the knob will pop right off. And once that's out of the way, you can use a pair of needle nose to unscrew the core, and this pops right out as well. At this point, it's just a matter of making sure everything else is disconnected. There are 2 ground wires in there you have to take out, as well as both door switch wires run through the area. Technically, the only thing from this harness that was missing was the engine bay harness. Everything from the firewall forward had been stripped. But as I mentioned, this is almost a 60-year-old car. And as far as I can tell, this is the original wire harness. So it makes sense just to replace the whole thing now before I get it back together. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call this an easy job, because it takes a lot of planning and a lot of patience, and routing the wires can be a pain in the butt. But I do think this is a job that most people could do. Especially if you go with one of the higher end name brand harnesses that has all the connectors and everything marked. At that point, it's just plug and play, putting Legos together. So, if this is something you were thinking about doing, don't let the complexity overwhelm you. Just take it one step at a time, do one area at a time, and eventually you get it right. I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler here, and it may be obvious to some of you, but I'm not going to complete this project on this video. And the main reason for that is not all the parts are installed. So I can't hook up wiring for parts that aren't installed. But I will make videos as I install those parts. And in those videos I'll hook up the wire. So, little shameless plug, if you want to see me complete this wiring project, subscribe and keep watching the channel. And I'll get those videos out to you as I make them. And once everything under the dash is disconnected, you want to come to the rear of the car, disconnect your brake lights, your fuel sending unit, your fuel pump. Hang on, let me get some wire cutters. So if you don't need the old wire harness for anything, you can snip it at the front door, and you can pull it from the front to back, and that would be easier. However, I'm trying to keep this wire harness as close to one piece as possible, and the taillight connectors are just too big to fit through the channel. So I'm going to snip those off, and I'll put the connector back on the taillight, and then I'll pull the rest of the wire from the back forward. Yes, I know I left the other connector on the trunk floor. I do end up putting it back on the taillight before I head forward again. And at this point, it's just a matter of snaking the cables forward and pulling the harness out. Now you may be asking yourself why I am so ungracefully laying out this tarp. Well, this is going to be my workspace for step 3, which is plan your attack. At this point, you're going to want to lay your harness out and make sure you're separating it into groups. So you'll have your tail section, you'll have your dash section, and then you'll have your 2 under the hood sections. This not only gives you an opportunity to inspect the wire harness to make sure everything is good, but it also lets you look through the different cables and figure out what you're going to need and what you don't. So I did mention that this is a 21 circuit wire harness. Realistically, a 12 circuit harness would have been more than enough. But this harness was a little cheaper than the 12 circuit for some reason. And let's be honest, I'm going to add things in the future, and I wanted to make sure that I had plenty of circuits to add anything and everything that I may ever want to do to this car. Once the new harness is laid out and separated, we take the old harness and we do the same thing. That way we have a template as we go through and get rid of the wires we don't need on the new harness. And next we go through all the wires one by one to figure out what we need to keep and what we need to get rid of. In my case, the only 2 wires I got rid of were the power antenna wire and the 3rd brake light. After separating and organizing all the wires, I took a nylon wire loom and wrapped the whole thing. This process is a bit time consuming, but it gives you a little extra protection and it makes the wire harness look so much better.
Now that the wire is wrapped, the next thing we need to do is get into the car. But before we can do that, we need to solve one little problem.
We need to decide where the wire is going to come through the firewall. This was where the engine harness originally came through. And this is where all the lights and the horns and things like that came through. Alright, so I didn't get a video of it, but I took a drill with that bit on it, put it in the hole, made room for the grommet, and put the grommet on. Little reenactment, same size hole, took the drill, put it in there, turned it on, pulled it out. Now with all that done, let's get to the main event. We are back in the car, and we're about ready to route this thing to get all the wires where they need to go. Alright. I'm going to get it mounted up here so that it's up high enough that it's out of the way, but it's still low enough that I can access the fuses. But for now, I'm going to leave it loose in hopes that that makes routing the wires easier.
And something to point out here. Once the wire gets to that nylon loom, they slide through the channels so incredibly easy. So it is absolutely worth taking the time to wrap your wires before you route them. And what you see here is I went and grabbed myself a pair of mechanical fingers and I pulled the wire through that channel one strand at a time until I can get to the wire loom and pull the whole thing through. And obviously I'm doing cuts to make the video flow, because you don't want to sit here and watch me for 30 minutes pulling one strand of wire at a time. But I cannot stress enough, take your time when doing this.
Alright, this little cable here is for trunk lights, dome light, and fuel pump. I've got a mechanical fuel pump, and I don't have the lights at the moment. All three of these things are items I want to add in the future, so I went ahead and wired them up. But since I don't have them now, I'm going to cap these off, I'll wrap the cable up, and I'll tuck it in the fender well until I'm ready to use it. As for the rest of this cable, all we need to do is route it where we need it, separate it between right and left, and wire it up.
Now that the wires are routed, we start working on the real fun. The kit came with a plug to wire in. I'll be honest, it does feel kind of cheap, but I'm going to run with it. The kit also came with connectors, but I'm not going to use these. If you haven't guessed yet, I plan on soldering these wires together. Just because I'm trying to do this inexpensively does not mean I shouldn't try to do it nicely. But don't get me wrong, there is nothing wrong with those connectors. I figure if I'm going to take the time to do this, why not do it so it's going to last? Now, if you remember, in the back here, I ended up saving the connectors for the taillights. That's because the kit did not come with taillight connectors. So I'm going to try to reuse these. But first I'm going to take my multimeter and check them to make sure they're going to be good, because I'd hate to solder these on and end up not having a good part. There we have it. You will notice I still have 4 wires to hook up back here. The 2 blue wires are reverse lights. But if you come down here, you'll notice this 65 does not have reverse lights. And that's because in 65 it's just an option. Now this wire is the fuel sending unit, and this wire is the license plate light, which will hook up to this. I just need to get the correct connector and put it on there and hook that up. And up front, the only other thing I can hook up right now is the horn. I just need to put a connector to hook up to there, and then have the line come across and hook up to there, and the horn will be hooked up. Now inside, I am going to do an entire different video for the gauge cluster.
It's not because I don't want to do it right now, but it's because all of the cluster gauge wires hook up with connectors like this. And while I could pull them off of the old harness like I did with the taillights, I'd like to see if I can source them first. And the other thing I've got to consider is what gauge cluster to use. Because I've got the original one that came off this, which I don't know if it works. And then I actually have two 66 clusters. The 66 clusters are a little nicer in my opinion. I like the aesthetics of them better. But I may stick with the original one as well. I haven't decided yet. So what do you think? Leave a comment. Let me know. Should I stick with the original 65 cluster or should I upgrade to a 66 cluster? And this is where I'm going to wrap it up this week. So I got the wire harness routed to where it needs to be. And I basically got the lights hooked up. I still need to get the reverse lights. I've still got to wire up the front turn signals, but those aren't on the car at the moment, so that'll have to wait. And I didn't touch anything on the engine yet because the only thing on the engine at the moment is the starter and the distributor. I could go ahead and hook those up now, but I want to get the other parts in first and kind of hook them all up at the same time. Closing thoughts on this video at this point. I've probably got between 6 and 8 hours worth of work on this project at this point. I wouldn't necessarily call it a hard project, but it certainly isn't easy either. Because you've got to keep track of all the different wires, and you've got to try to route it through tight places. The biggest tip I can give for this is take your time. Don't be in a hurry. Over budget yourself some time on this because you're going to run into hiccups. You're going to run into difficulties. You're going to get distractions. If you are going to rewire your daily driver and you think you could do it in a weekend, you probably could if you spent the whole weekend. But in my opinion, it's going to be stressful because you have a deadline. So that's it for this week. My air pump should come in on Monday, so I should get the compressor system built, and hopefully we'll be laying down some primer by the end of next week. So thanks for watching. Get out and work on your project, and have a good weekend.